Hello, everyone. Welcome to DEI, a podcast dedicated to discussing and raising awareness on the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. My name is Kara Xie, and we are thrilled today to have Mr. Joseph Longley with us. Mr. Longley is a civil rights attorney and a leading advocate for disability justice, with a career spanning grassroots advocacy, government policy, and high impact litigation. As a staff attorney with the ACLU's Disability Rights Program, he has fought landmark cases challenging prisons and jails that deny life-saving addiction treatment, arguing that such practices violate Americans with Disability Acts and that the Eighth Amendment. Prior to joining the ACLU, Mr. Longley worked in faith-based nonprofit advancing social justice, served as a senior advisor at the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, and clerked for a federal judge. His work bridges legal strategy with systemic reform, centering disability rights at the heart of civil liberties. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Longley.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start with a little bit introduction about you. So I know you've had such a unique path, starting with faith-based advocacy and then clerking for judges, everything that I just introduced, and now serving at ACLU. The journey feels really deeply personal. So how has your identity, your lived experience shaped you into this path for justice and civil liberties?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and it has been really personal. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, about 900 people in my hometown. Went to a public school, had about 29 kids in my class. We didn't have any, AP classes, really IB classes, none of that. It was, pretty small place. I grew up the child of two ministers, two really wonderful people who cared a lot about the community, a lot of the ethical convictions came from the faith. I as I got older and was exploring the world and politics and social justice and faith, I really saw my Christian faith as kind of like a command to care for those that the Bible calls the least of these. Um,
Mhm.
People who've been marginalized and put on the outskirts of society by kind of dominant culture.
Right.
So I graduated from college and worked at kind of progressive faith-based nonprofit called Sojourners here in Washington, D.C. And then moved to Union Theological Seminary up in New York City, and really got to explore kind of what it looks like to be both deeply faithful on one hand and also deeply, deeply concerned, about the least of these. So that was, what kind of motivated me to take the path that I'm on today.
Yeah, wow. I know. I think a lot of like our experience about being marginalized and seeing those marginalized really helps empower us to step forward in that. And your work really inspires a lot of people, I'm very sure. Um, and I know that you've been at the center of cases where incarcerated people were denied access to life-saving addiction treatments like methadone. Actually, in my supplemental essays, I mentioned my ACLA experience and you were part of it because I was talking about how like you and Miss Kate Huddleston were fighting against like with your legal background fighting for rights and how that's why I wanted to pursue political science and like I used that in one of my essays. So um I know that in some cases like Pessy versus the Copinger and similar suits, the stakes were very life and death. Can you take us inside one of those cases, the journey, and how you fought successfully for their civil rights?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it is the stakes are, extremely high. And I think that working with clients is something that is almost sacred. It's so special to be trusted with really somebody's legal case that could determine how the course of their life plays out, because that's how critical these medications are. So you mentioned it. I work mostly on cases expanding access to medications through opioid use disorder, medications like methadone, like Suboxone, that are really the difference between somebody's being able to stay in recovery from the substance use disorder, from the opioid use disorder, and somebody falling back into the worst for addiction and being at risk of relapse and overdose and death. And we've seen, through the last several years until this past year, we've seen over 100,000 overdose deaths every year in this country, which is, more than gun violence and car accidents combined. Um,
Mhm.
and so I think that, uh, when we do these cases, they're oftentimes on behalf of like one single individual, and we're hoping to be able to, win the case and get them the medication that they need, but also set a precedent and send a message to jails and prisons across the country that they need to provide this medication, or else they'll face legal consequences because it's, we've been quite
Right.
successful and seen victories across the country under both the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Eighth Amendment saying it's cruel and unusual punishment not to provide this medication.
Yeah. And I think it's very impactful that like one law can it changes one person's life, but then it affects a million people's lives. And you also mentioned like right now with recent political stakes and everything, how I saw that the Trump administration is moving to a new executive order on crime and disorder that expands civil commitment and proposals to cut SSI benefits for nearly like 400,000 low income seniors and disabled people that protect disability rights. So, um, how do you see those moves? And more importantly, what is ACLU and you doing to push back at this moment for those people who need those rights?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. The executive order also targeted harm reduction organizations. And these are, kind of frontline um, organizations that are treating people who have active substance use disorder. It doesn't, without those people, a lot of folks would not be reached with the social services, the healthcare, the other
Mhm.
supports that they need in order to live the life they want to live.
Right.
And that's, not only bad for them, but bad for everybody. I
Mhm.
also want to mention the, $1 trillion of Medicaid cuts in the One Beautiful bill,
Right. Yes.
which, I mean, that is Medicaid is a lifeline. It's the number
Mhm.
one payer for addiction medicine and recovery support in the country. And as kind of the way that those $1 trillion of cuts are being implemented is we're adding a whole bunch of paperwork requirements,
Yeah.
require people to certify that they're meeting job requirements and all of that kind of stuff. And 93% of people who are on Medicaid work or have a qualifying disability to not have
Mhm.
to work. Yet the $1 trillion in cuts is going to kick off way more than
Right.
the 7% of people who are working who don't have a qualifying disability. And that's because it's going to be really complicated to recertify every 6 months. And so, one of the things that we're looking at is how can we lift up ways for states as we're implementing this to have as much support for people with disabilities as possible to comply with these requirements so that they continue to have the health care that they need through Medicaid, which we know is just such a critical lifeline, people living lives of self-directed lives of dignity. Um, and so, we obviously, really actively monitoring, what the Trump administration is doing. And as these kind of things get implemented, if they're not complying with the ADA, we'll definitely be on notice.
Right. I'm really glad ACLU and you are fighting for that because like the big beautiful bill really throws off like not only people with healthcare access, it throws like off like education and people like who don't it can't afford it. Like it just creates this big wealth gap between people that makes it worse, makes the current society worse. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And we've seen, what people need is healthcare, they need housing,
right.
jobs, and uh, what they don't need is more policing and more, these kind of punitive state interventions that make it harder for them to find the things that they need and the things that we know make them succeed. And so we're just seeing kind of, the opposite, more funding into police and less funding into social services when, the evidence is clear that the social services are what people need.
Right. Yeah, at this time, I really think we need a lot of like social justices. And I know like your work does deal with like um mainly disabilities, but it also disability rights intersect with a lot of other struggles like homelessness, systemic inequality, all that. And when you're in a courtroom or shaping a strategy to fight, how do you balance those intersections? And I know we mentioned in our elective that sometimes certain needs of groups, like certain groups need things that conflict with others. So, how do you balance those intersections and make sure that the rights you're advocating for doesn't go in conflict, but actually uplifts all those connected issues?
Well, I mean, yeah, I do think that there are times when certainly there can be conflicts between groups, but I think the most important thing is having solidarity with one another, and
Mm,
um, there's so much that brings us together, and all of that is so much bigger than what drives us apart.
right.
And I think focusing on ensuring that, everybody has what they need. We're in, the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And the idea that we can't have, healthcare and housing, and, addiction medicine and, all of the things that we know point us to success and to people having, long-term positive outcomes, being able to be with their families, live their lives. Um, we really can do that. And
Right.
I think that, being the kind of like God welcoming coalition of people that are building tangible things that are, really make a, a perceptible difference in people's lives is so important. And that's why I think that I'm focusing my work on addiction medicine and on, ensuring people have access to these evidence-based treatments is that like, I mean, the difference that makes in people's lives is really night and day. And
Yeah.
that, medications through opioid use disorder, for example, it cuts the rate of overdose mortality in half, 50% goes down. And that is the difference between life and death for thousands and thousands of people every year.
Mhm.
And so, I think that like the the both the beauty and the difficulty of fighting for social justice is that, just working on one element of social justice is not going to fix everything.
Yeah.
Um, but the beauty of it is that, as you said, it's all interconnected. And so the fact that I'm working on addiction medicine, someone else is working on housing, somebody else is working on immigration justice, someone else is working on LGBT justice, as we kind of continue to work together, many people are immigrants who are LGBT who have a substance use disorder. And if we can get the substance use disorder taken care of, that leaves fewer issues for them to have to, work on in order to have the kind of lives that they want to lead.
Right.
And so, will it fix everything? No, but is it, absolutely worthwhile and something that I think contributes to everything else that the ACLU, social justice advocates, organizers all across the country are working on? Absolutely, and that's
Mhm.
really exciting. And I think that that sort of perspective, I think, makes it easier to dive in instead of being like overwhelmed with how many problems there are.
Right, right, yeah. And I think like me and a lot of my podcast listeners, like Gen Z adults, Gen Z children and like high schoolers would really be inspired by the work you guys do. Um, and a lot of young people listening to my podcast really care deeply about justice. And although they're in high school or in college, they aren't necessarily yet lawyers or policy experts. And for a generation who needs and really wants to take action, but often feels shut out by the legal system, especially the um, recent political climate, what's one meaningful way you think we can get involved with protecting rights and civil liberties right now?
I mean, I think that one of the most important things that you can do is organize and work in the communities to build broad-based coalitions of people that are advocating for, the rights that we fight for, which are the rights in the Constitution, and rights and civil rights laws that we have in this nation. And if we can build a majority of people who are supportive of those rights, I think
Mhm.
incredibly important. And I think that organizing looks different to everybody. It can be you know informal community organizing and knocking on doors and having a goal of what you're doing and power mapping and figuring out how you want to make change. And it can also be like leveraging the relationships that you have already in your life um, to build shared values and a culture where people feel that they want to be a part of this movement. Um, and I think it's young people like will always set the tone of the culture. And I think it's, so important to be engaged and fighting for, the justice that we all want to see in the world.
Mhm.
So I think, not shutting down and being engaged and being on the ground in the communities, building those kind of coalitions is just the best thing that young people can be doing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the advice. I think we can all like really learn from this as well. Thank you so much for being here today. That was our last ending question, and I'm sure that you brought a lot of impact for us. And also, I was really, really inspired by your elective at ACLU too. I just wanted to let you know that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much for having me. It's been a
And
blast.
that concludes today's episode on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Before we sign off, thank you for listening to Don't Erase My Identity. Stay tuned for next week's episode.